So continuing on with our discussion of behavior, and again, remember, we're not just talking about animal behavior, but all organisms to some degree show behaviors, including plants, bacteria. But continuing on with our discussion of behavior in the light of evolution in an evolutionary context, let's move to discuss the evolution of individual behavior versus group behavior and the evolution of social behavior. So in 1962, a biologist by the name of Wynne Edwards argued that group selection explains many behaviors. So up to this point, you may not have heard about group selection. Certainly in this class, we have emphasized individual selection. The idea that individual organisms are selected by environmental factors to survive and reproduce, perhaps more effectively or less effectively than other individual organisms. This idea says that there are certain behaviors that individuals may have that could contribute to the, quote, here comes maybe a familiar phrase, good of the group, right? For the good of the group. Let's take, for example, an individual organism having 6 offspring versus 3 offspring. And our textbook kind of talks about an example like this with birds living on 2 different islands. So island number 1, the birds lay 6 eggs, the females, per reproductive effort. And island number 2, the female birds lay 3 eggs per reproductive effort. Well, on the island with 6 eggs per reproductive effort, the population is going to grow more quickly than the other island, and potentially could deplete food resources, at which point the entire population crashes because resources have been depleted. Whereas on another island where females are laying 3 eggs per reproductive effort, the population doesn't grow as quickly, or perhaps it's stable. And so over time, over generations, there's plenty of resources for everyone. So the idea of Wynne Edwards is that certain behaviors might be favored or selected because it's better for the entire group in the long term. Better for the group rather than the individual. And indeed, we can see that there may be variation in fitness among groups. So, for example, what I just talked about that comes out of your book, birds laying 6 eggs per effort on one island versus 3 eggs on another island. There's going to be variations in fitness among those groups. A selfish behavior under this model, like, hey, I'm going to have more offspring because it serves me better, is not predicted to persist if group selection is stronger than individual selection. Okay? If the group selection is stronger than any organism that's selfish, just looking out for itself, that group selection would overpower it. This is part of what Wynne Edwards was arguing. Well, a couple biologists came along after that, and Smith and Williams, John Maynard Smith and Williams, and they argued separately in their papers that selection on individual organisms, can counteract or even overwhelm group selection. And that the fitness advantages caused by such selfishness of individuals would cause that kind of behavior to spread and increase. And so they provided pretty firm arguments against Wynne Edwards, demonstrating that the group selection argument doesn't hold up and that individual selection will almost always prevail. And indeed, at this point in time, just to kind of fast forward to today, the group selection argument has not held up, and the individual fitness argument has really won the day. But there are some caveats and exceptions that we'll get to several slides down here involving kin selection. So we'll get to that. So while I'm in the middle of the slide, group selection would favor a low reproductive rate, such that resources are not diminished. So again, think about that bird example. If there's birds on one island that are reproducing 3 eggs per effort, then group selection would favor that because the resources would not be diminished as much. But imagine a bird being born on that island that had the capability and the behavior to lay 6 eggs per reproductive effort. Well, over generations, that bird will out-reproduce and more successfully pass on the genetics for laying 6 eggs per generation than those birds laying 3 eggs. So that selfish individual will outperform the non-selfish ones. And individual selection will prevail over group selection. So group selection just doesn't hold up. We could even look back to our unicellular slime mold example from earlier in this chapter, where individual slime molds come together when the times get tough and form that slug-like entity that crawls along and consumes bacteria and then eventually produces a column with spores being released at the top. And as you learned, the cheetah allele came along, and the cheetah allele, once it spreads to fixation, then cooperative slugs cannot form, and the cells cannot escape their harsh environment. So that's showing that individual fitness prevails over group fitness. Individuals with that cheetah allele end up doing better or more successful than individuals with the wild type allele. Selfishness prevails. And finally, I already mentioned this up there a little bit higher, but we will get to kin selection. So that is one example that is an exception to saying there is never any kind of group selection. So we'll take a look at that shortly. All right, so remember back in chapter 6, we were introduced to frequency-dependent selection. And that was the concept that whichever phenotype is less common compared to an alternative phenotype actually has an evolutionary advantage by natural selection. And the bumblebees was one example with that, with different colored flowers. So as that relatively rare phenotype has an advantage and its numbers increase, its frequency increases, eventually the alternative phenotype becomes more rare, less frequent, and then it has an evolutionary advantage, and the population oscillates back and forth between the two phenotypes. Well, this occurs in some cases with the evolution of behaviors, where alternative behaviors, a less frequent or a less common behavior, might have an evolutionary advantage over a more common behavior. Cheaters, for example, are favored at low frequency, but as they reproduce and pass on their genes for cheating and go to high frequency, cheating no longer is an advantage. Now, game theory is something that was developed in the field of economics, and it's a mathematically based model to help economists determine which economic strategies might be the most productive for the most individuals to have the healthiest economy. So game theory helps economists to figure out the best strategies. Biologists borrowed game theory, saying, hey, we can use that in biology to help determine the best strategy in the world of behavior among alternatives, or what the best balance of behaviors is in the long run. And so that's what we're going to look at here. Game theory was adopted by biologists and applied to understand the evolution of behavior. So an evolutionarily stable strategy is one, in this case a behavior, one in which if it's adopted by a population in a given environment, that behavior cannot be invaded by any alternative behavior or strategy. That would be considered an evolutionarily stable strategy. But if there are alternative behaviors that can invade and do better than what exists, then what already exists is not evolutionarily stable. So here's an example, bringing all this together with side blotch lizards, demonstrating frequency-dependent selection. And a biologist by the name of Barry Sinervo, who at the time of the publication of this book was at UC Santa Cruz, and he applied game theory with frequency-dependent selection to understand the evolution of alternative behaviors in side-blotched lizards called Uta stansburiana. And the side-blotched lizards are shown here in this figure. Side-blotched lizards are extremely common in the desert Southwest. If you were to take a trip up to, say, Thunderbird Park locally, or South Mountain, or Sierra Estrella, or virtually anywhere out in the desert, you would find side-blotched lizards. Now, the males, side-blotched lizards, have one of three colors on their throats, and these colors are genetically determined. They're heritable. If you're an orange-throated male, then you are born being relatively large, and you are relatively aggressive, and this morphology of being large and aggressive enables them to hold big territories with multiple females that they guard and that they mate with. Sounds like a winning strategy for males that are born with orange throats. Big, aggressive, can have big territories with lots of females. If you're born as a blue-throated male, you're still relatively large, but you're less aggressive than the orange-throated ones, and you only have a territory where you guard a single female. Sounds like it might not work as well, but just you wait. There's also, in these populations, males that are born with yellow throats, and they're smaller, and in fact, their color and size mimics female lizards, which of course don't hold territories. And these are sneaker males. So these guys will sneak into the territory of an orange-throated male or a blue-throated male and mate with the females, especially the orange-throated ones, mate with the females in his territory, sneak in and mate. And then of course the female would lay eggs where the offspring are carrying genes from that yellow-throated male, that cheater. So sneaker. So these are the three morphs. And this is referred to, the cycle of these behaviors referred to as the rock, paper, scissors sort of game. And if you're familiar with that game, you understand that there's no winning strategy. You can never have a true winner in rock, paper, scissors. Because rock always beats scissors, scissors always beats paper, paper always beats rock, and it's a never-ending cycle. And that's essentially what happens in these local populations of side-blotched lizards. These behaviors oscillate from generation to generation, and no single behavior in this scenario is evolutionarily stable. None of these behaviors and color patterns ultimately wins out over the others in the long term. Let me explain why. So imagine you have a population, let's start in the upper left corner, that has orange males, and they're at a relatively low frequency, okay? And now they're able to hold their large territories with lots of females, and so they're doing well. You know, they're passing on their genetics to offspring via their multiple females, and they're doing pretty well. Now, the yellow-throated sneaker males, they're able to sneak into those orange-throated male territories as they're becoming more abundant. And, you know, those orange-throated males, not only do the yellow-throated males look like females, so they can sort of trick those orange-throated males, but the orange-throated males have a tough time monitoring their whole territory with all these females. So the yellow-throated males are sneaking in and mating with the females, and those alleles now start increasing in frequency. So paper beats rock in the rock, paper, scissors game. So yellow is now beating orange. So now the population starts to show an increased frequency in the number of yellow-throated males. Now, blue-throated males are then able to have an advantage because they are holding territories with only one female, unlike the orange-throated ones that have multiple females. And so the blue-throated males now are able to hold that territory with one female, and they're able to fend off those yellow-throated males and prevent them from mating with their single female. So now the blue-throated males become more common, and the population increases in frequency with the blue-throated males. But then the orange-throated males once again gain an advantage because they are able to hold territories that are, hold multiple females, whereas the blue-throated males are only holding territories with one female. So now the blue-throated males are at a disadvantage compared to the orange-throated ones, and the cycle continues. Orange begins to go back up in frequency. And as that happens, the yellow ones start sneaking in and they gain a higher frequency. And as that happens, the blue ones sneak in and they then achieve a higher frequency, holding territories with one female, and on it goes. There is no evolutionarily stable strategy here, but frequency-dependent selection is what's keeping these populations of side-blotch lizards with these multiple colors and multiple mating strategies. So now that we've gone over how individual fitness can, overtake group fitness, and the advantage to the individual outweighs the advantage to the group, and we've seen how, frequency-dependent selection can cause multiple behaviors to be favored in a population. We just saw that with the side-blotch lizards. Then why even be social? What benefit might there be to animals to even be social? Well, basically it just comes down to if the benefits of social behavior outweigh the individual costs of individual behavior, then social behavior will increase. So if the benefits of social behavior to the individual organism, if it's a benefit to the individual organism to be social, and the benefits of being social to that individual outweigh the costs to that individual, then social behavior will increase in frequency. So what are some of the benefits of social behavior? Well, there's numerous ones, and table 16.1 summarizes some of these, as well as the costs. So for example, I've listed them here on the slide to summarize them, and the benefits and the costs. So increased vigilance. So if you're social, then you've got more eyes and more ears to detect predators. You're more vigilant overall, and that's a benefit to the individual, to have more eyes and ears to detect predators. But there's a cost to that as well. You can see that on the table. There's also increased conspicuousness to predators. So the more individuals there are in this group that are all looking and listening, then predators are going to be able to see those individuals in this bigger group more easily. So benefit and cost. There's also a dilution effect. So the benefits to being in a group and being social is that it's more difficult for a predator to target you. There's a smaller risk of being a target. And so really, you can refer to that as being in a selfish herd. Yes, you're in a herd, but you're in a herd, like a herd of elk, for example, or a herd of antelope, because it's to your benefit as an individual. It makes it less likely that a predator will pick you out and target you. But look at the table again. The cost to that is that there's increased competition for food. So there's more individuals to be on the watch for predators, but at the same time, more individuals mean food is being consumed. There's a cost. Okay, another benefit to being social is enhanced defense capability. So more individuals means they can kind of gang up on a predator and attack the predator, as a group, and fight off the predator. But a cost to that is that there's increased competition for mates as well. So, it's harder to get a mate when you're in a group. And then we've got cooperative foraging and hunting, okay, like wolves. They do better as a pack in getting prey than individuals, right? And then finally, improved defense of critical resources. So that's another one. And then finally, the two final costs that are listed on the other side: decreased certainty of paternity or maternity, and then increased transmission of disease and parasites. So if you're in a more crowded group, then there's a higher likelihood that you might get a disease or parasite from another individual. So you can see that if the benefits of being social outweigh the costs, then sociality will be selected at the individual level. But if the costs of being social outweigh the benefits for individuals, then natural selection will not favor social behavior. Continuing on with why be social, let's look at an example where increased sociality, increased group size provides a benefit to the individual. Benefit to the individual. Again, that's the emphasis here. And also an example where increased group size and sociality might carry a cost to an individual. So for the benefit, let's take a look at the top image, the top picture with African hunting dogs and the associated graph to the right of that photograph. So they hunt in packs, and by hunting in packs, it increases the chances that these hunting dogs will be able to subdue prey, take down something large, and get a meal. So each individual also, through this group effort, obtains more energy. So look at the graph to the right. What's been empirically shown is that the bigger the pack size, in terms of number of adults, then the larger the net amount of energy that's being in kilojoules that's being acquired by each adult. So there's the benefit to the individual in being social and in hunting in a pack. Now look at the bottom example with cliff swallows, where they nest in communities and they pack all these mud nests up, against cliffs or under bridges and so on. And there's protection in numbers, but there's also a higher cost because by having their nests so close together, they're transmitting parasites more frequently, and they tend to be infested with more parasites. So if you look at the graph that's associated with that, colony size, number of nests ranging from 0 to 2,000. And on the vertical axis, number of bugs per nest per week, so the parasite load. So as the colony size increases, you can see via the graph that the number of infestations by parasites per nest also goes up. So there's a cost to having that increased sociality. So while there are benefits, there are in turn costs. Now the last point to be made on this slide, and it's the last point made in this section in your textbook, is that having a hierarchical group organization, a hierarchical group where some individuals win out more than other individuals, individuals that are more dominant, have more power in the group, tend to have a higher individual fitness than individuals that have less power. So there's different costs and different benefits to the individuals in these groups. Not everybody's coming out the same. And so there's different optimal behaviors to different individuals. Let's say, for example, in a pack where there's a dominant individual, male or female, that dominant individual is probably going to have to work less for food. It's going to be like the center of the pack. It's going to be protected by the individuals in the periphery. And so there's a big benefit to that dominant individual. The individuals on the periphery are having to work more for the food. There are benefits to being in this group, but they have to do more of the work, and they may be more susceptible to predators. Well, it might come to a point where those susceptible, vulnerable individuals would be better off by going out as single individuals and being loners. There might be a greater benefit to doing that than staying in the group. So in groups with hierarchical organization, there are different costs and different benefits to different individuals, and those are going to be borne out, and those individuals are then going to potentially pursue different behaviors that most benefit them as individuals. Again, it always comes down to what works best for the individual. Individual selection, not group selection. So remember a little bit earlier in this narration at the beginning, it was said that there might be an exception to the argument against group selection in the form of kin selection. Well, here it is. And first we're going to start off here with a definition of altruism. Altruism is a behavior whereby individuals help other individuals. Oftentimes, seemingly, or in actuality, to the detriment of the helper. And that seems to support the group selection theory, that individuals seem to be willing to do something for the good of the group. But closer inspection shows that that's not quite how we should be interpreting what's going on. Now, many studies, in biology show that helping raises the fitness of the helper compared to going alone. So that alone shows that it's not about group selection, but about individual selection. If you help others in a group, it might actually raise your fitness as a helper compared to if you don't help others in a group and you go alone. For example, by being in a group, you can have increased foraging success. You can have a better chance of finding food resources. You can have faster growth, and you can thereby have higher survival rates. Another advantage of being in a group and helping others is that you may gain experience before, quote, going alone, making it on your own. And that experience might increase your survival and your fitness. And a third, example or reason of how helping others might be a benefit compared to going alone is that you might gain acquaintance with potential mates in your group, so that when you are in a position where you maybe become reproductively capable, then you might be familiar with the dynamics of the group and individuals that you might be able to mate with. Now, this kind of altruism, of helping others in a group, most often occurs among close relatives. And that's where it involves what's called kin selection. That is, it's your benefit as an individual to help others who are closely related to you, who are your kin. Because by helping them, remember, they carry alleles that are the same as your alleles. There's a closer relationship there in terms of your genetics. So by helping others who are related to you and helping them to reproduce, you are, in effect, helping your fitness, because your alleles are also being promoted and increasing. And this is called inclusive fitness. So it's not just the fitness of yourself going it alone and reproducing on your own, but by helping others who are closely related to you, you're expanding your fitness, and that is called inclusive fitness. Hence, this is why it's a benefit, as a little sidetrack here, for, say, a grandmother, human, to help her daughter raise her grandchildren. There is inclusive fitness involved there. Now, of course, a grandmother means that you can't reproduce anymore. So maybe a better example would be a cousin or a niece helping, another cousin or an aunt to raise their children. Inclusive fitness. By doing that, when you're in a position perhaps to not reproduce yourself, you are in fact in helping yourself through your inclusive fitness by helping others. So the cost of helping others is essentially paid back by benefiting genetically similar individuals. And that is where, so this ends up not being group selection. It's still individual selection, but individuals are helping others and showing what appears to be altruistic behaviors, because by helping others who are closely related to you, ultimately helps yourself genetically. Lastly on this slide, Hamilton's rule. RB, if RB is the product of R and B is greater than C, then altruism is going to be a benefit. So R is a coefficient of relatedness. So if you look over at table 16.2 in the bottom right of the slide, then the coefficient of relatedness for offspring, siblings, is 0.5. So those are full siblings. 50% of your genetics is shared with your siblings. The coefficient of relatedness, R, for not offspring but grandchildren, is 0.25. So, less relatedness there. So that applies to half siblings, nephews, nieces. And finally, if we go another level, cousins, great grandchildren, then the coefficient of relatedness is even lower, 0.125. So the more distantly related you become from another individual, your coefficient of relatedness goes down. B is a measurable benefit to the recipient, and C is the cost to the donor, to the helper. All right, so if you think about all that, if your coefficient of relatedness is high, say 0.5, and you multiply that by the benefit to the recipient, and if that product is greater than the cost to the donor, then that behavior will be favored, that seemingly altruistic behavior. But say, for example, the coefficient of relatedness is very low, and the benefit to the recipient is, well, it could be high or it could be low, but the product of those is less than the cost to the donor, then that altruistic behavior will not be benefited. So we can actually put this in measurable terms at what point a behavior is beneficial to be altruistic versus flipping the coin and that altruistic behavior now becomes too costly, perhaps because the coefficient of relatedness is so low, in which case altruism would not be favored. So it's all about, ultimately, really, how closely related you are to other individuals in nature as to whether that altruistic behavior is beneficial. So an interesting thing that we won't get into here is that when it comes to humans, we tend to very often help individuals who are not closely related to us. Somebody, maybe you're out in public and somebody needs help, you go and help them. Well, that opens up a whole different discussion that we're not going to get to here, but it's just pointing out that humans, once again, exhibit some behaviors that are different from other animals, and of course there are potentially evolutionary reasons for that. So we've got two examples here on this slide that are applying Hamilton's rule, where the product of R, the coefficient of relatedness, multiplied by B, the benefit to the recipient, is if that outweighs, if that's greater than the cost to the donor, then that behavior is going to be favored. So we've got two examples. One is with Belding's ground squirrels, and the other one on the bottom is with these cute little birdies. So with Belding's ground squirrels, individuals can give an alarm call. They live in groups, they're social groups, and when a predator approaches, an individual can give an alarm call that warns the others that there's a predator approaching, like a hawk circling around. Now the alarm call is risky. Why? Because it brings attention, it draws attention to that ground squirrel that's out there vocalizing, making noise, screaming, and the predator can go, oh, where's that noise coming from? Oh, it's down there, that squirrel that's screaming, well, I'm going to go after it. But that alarm call gives others time to escape. Well, as it turns out, females are more likely to give alarm calls than males. And the reason for that is because females tend to be more closely related to other group members. If we look at the top of the figure, the graph, it's showing you what's expected in terms of the frequency of alarm calls by different individuals. That's that staggered kind of stair-step solid blue line. And that's what's expected from Hamilton's rule. And then we have what's actually observed, which is plotted out as those light blue bars. And so if you're an adult female in one of these colonies, then you can see the frequency of alarm calls, what's expected based on the relationship, and actually what's observed is much higher. And then as you go down to adult males, 1 year females, 1 year males, and work your way down, you can see that for certain individuals where the what's observed is not as high as expected, that is because of the costs outweighing the benefits, and that coefficient of relatedness is less. And so the behavior is not, the alarm call behavior is not a benefit to the individual. So one thing I need to tell you about these ground squirrels is that the females tend to stay in the colonies where they are born. So they tend to be very closely related to everybody else. Whereas males tend to be kicked out of the colony when they get old enough to be reproductive, and they leave and go to another colony. So the adult males tend to not be very closely related to the other individuals in the colony. So the adult males, having a low coefficient of relatedness to everybody else would be expected to not have that high of a frequency of alarm calls, and in fact they don't. It's the observed amount is very much lower because of that. So on the bottom figure with these birds, I'm forgetting what these birds are called, instead of breeding in their first 2 years of life, the offspring help their parents during harsh years. And so there we have kin selection again. The offspring are helping the parents raise their siblings. And the coefficient of relatedness determines the degree of help. So if you look at the bar graphs, you can see the first bar graph is showing coefficient of relatedness as compared to the amount of gain that the individual gets from helping in terms of offspring equivalence. You're helping your siblings that are hatching from eggs that you're helping with to survive. So the higher the coefficient of relatedness, then the bigger gain there is from helping. And you can see that incremental relationship in the graph. You can also look in the very bottom right graph. Coefficient of relatedness is also related to the probability of helping. So the more closely related, if there's a 50% coefficient of relatedness, then the probability of helping with your siblings, to help your siblings, is very high. If the coefficient of relatedness is just 0.25, then the probability of helping goes down. So these things are all, circling around here in these populations, and natural selection has helped these various behaviors pan out. If your coefficient of relatedness is very high, then the probability of helping is very high, and the gains from helping is very high. If your coefficient of relatedness is very low, or indeed is 0, then the probability of helping is very low because the gain from helping is very low. So natural selection is ultimately what helps all of these behaviors pan out. And again, it's not having anything to do with group selection, but it has to do with kin selection. And Hamilton's rule helps us to see where that trade-off is between helping or not helping. So as we've seen from these examples, kin selection comes about or arises from the indirect benefits of helping relatives. By helping relatives, you're helping yourself in terms of promoting your inclusive fitness, in terms of promoting the success of your alleles, which are shared in relatives. But there's a problem. You've got to be able to recognize your kin. You've got to be able to recognize your close relatives in order to know, if you will, whether you should help those individuals or not. Now, for animals that have internal development of their young and give birth in that way, well, then there's a very high certainty that the kin are closely related in those species because they all developed in their mother's uterus together. So there is a high amount of confidence that an individual can have that if they're helping others in their group, they are helping their kin. Or for those individuals where females lay eggs placed in a burrow or in a nest, and then they hatch. Okay, if you're all in the same burrow or the same nest, and then there's a high likelihood that you are closely related to those other individuals, and so helping them would be a benefit to you indirectly. But physical proximity is not always a great or reliable indicator for males for a variety of reasons. So, for example, females can mate with multiple males. And if you as a male invest a lot of time and energy into the offspring of the female you mated with, it might be that that female's offspring are not yours because she may have mated with another male that you didn't know about. So physical proximity isn't a surefire way to know about your relationship with offspring alone. So therefore, parental investment by males is less common because there's less certainty of paternity for males than there is certainty of maternity for females that are giving birth. So if there's a very low certainty of paternity, we're going to predict that we wouldn't see, and we don't see much investment by males in nature. And that's the case, right? In many cases, females are raising their young alone without male help, precisely for that reason. Males have a low certainty of paternity, so there's no evolutionary reason why they should help. Now, species with elaborate courtship behaviors or multiple bouts of copulation can increase the certainty of paternity. So if a male is going through and a female are going through all these rituals in terms of courtship behavior, doing little dances and bobbing their heads and so on, that takes a big investment of time and energy. So if a female ends up mating with you as a male and choosing you after all that elaborate courtship, then there's a pretty good certainty that her offspring are going to be yours. Or if you as a male are able to copulate with a single female many times, then again, you have a higher certainty of paternity. And then in those cases, we would expect to see, and we do see, males investing more in their potential offspring. So it all becomes evolutionarily determined, the degree to which males are investing in offspring, based on their certainty of paternity. Now finally, in some cases, animals might have a means to recognize their kin or their close relatives. So there might be some phenotypic trait that are able to be recognized, that, oh, you're closely related to me, you're kin because we share this trait. Or odor. So there's major histocompatibility genes, immunity sort of genes in mammals, where if you share those genes with a close relative, then you tend to give off an odor that reflects that, and that can be detected. And so you know that you're with close relatives, you know you're with kin because of an odor that's given off. Or communal nests and house mice, they show this as well. Odors that are given off showing that you are close relatives. So as I put at the very end on the bottom there, again, altruism, helping others that are closely related to you, who are kin, increases your inclusive fitness and helps promote your genetics. By the way, the photo or the image of this bug, this water bug on this slide, males are carrying and guarding the eggs because they have a high certainty of paternity that those eggs were fertilized by him. And so in the case of the water bugs, it's not the females that are carrying around the eggs, it's the males. Because they have a vested interest in doing that, knowing that those offspring are likely to be his. All right, well, let's wrap up our chapter on behavioral evolution of behavior by taking a look at intelligence and other forms of complex cognition. So we can certainly gain insights into our own behavior, our own human behavior, by looking at other animals. And we do this all the time in our everyday lives. And of course, biologists do this by using animals as models for studying human behavior and then drawing connections to us humans. But we have to be really careful of anthropomorphism. We have to be really careful of taking human behaviors and labeling other animals and saying, oh, look, they're doing this behavior because, giving an explanation, but we're explaining the behavior on human terms. We're explaining the behavior based on what we do as humans, and we have to be careful about doing that. because the reasons for some other animals' behavior might be different from the reasons for our own behavior. So we have to be careful about anthropocentrism or anthropomorphism. Anthropocentrism is focusing on humans. Anthropomorphism is attributing other behaviors as being human-like. So let's also take a look at what the definition of intelligence is. So as we're talking about intelligence here and gauging intelligence in other animals, we need to have some understanding of what intelligence is. And intelligence is a collection of sophisticated cognitive abilities. And these cognitive abilities include things such as problem solving, that I think most of us would agree involves intelligence, complex social recognition, being able to recognize others in your group would be a manifestation of intelligence, and finally, being able to engage in future planning, being able to anticipate what might happen in the future and planning accordingly. All three of these examples, problem solving, complex social recognition, future planning, are all collections of sophisticated cognitive abilities. Therefore, they can be attributed to intelligence. Now, we as humans, of course, exhibit all of these things, and we make very complex tools. I mean, indeed, the computer that you're using right now is a complex tool, and we use language in a very complex way. Not just nonverbal language, but importantly for humans, verbal language, having so many different words with so many different meanings. But other species do the same thing. So we can gain insights by looking at other species and seeing how they make tools and how they develop language. We just have to be very careful about interpreting those, and again, not being using anthropomorphism. So for example, there's lots of examples in your book. Chimpanzees make sounds and use gestures. They're physically unable to make words like we can. They do not have a larynx or a voice box and a facial, musculature with their tongues, etc., to be able to make words and sounds like humans can. So they're physically limited. But they do make sounds and use gestures that are usually associated with requests, with asking for something from another chimpanzee. And when it comes to tool use, you were exposed to the new Caledonian crow at the beginning of the chapter, and they indeed are tool users for gathering and finding food. Chimps use tools. Gorillas use sticks, for example, to test water depth so they know if it's too deep to walk. Dolphins put sponges on their noses, on their rostrums, to protect their skin while they're probing around on the bottom of the ocean in a coral reef looking for food. So all of these, there's many examples of tool use in other species of animals. So language and tools. Now, tool making, of course, demands the capacity for innovations, for being able to develop new things, to be able to, solve problems and improve fitness. So coming up with new solutions. You have to be able to picture a goal in your head. So an animal's got to be able to picture a goal and have that goal in mind for developing a tool to know what is needed, what tool is needed, and how to use it. And the animal also has to have an understanding of its physical world, the world it lives in, to know what can be used as a tool and what that tool might do. So tool making demands the capacity for innovations because of those components, coming up with new solutions. Also, the degree of sociality in different kinds of animals is directly related to brain size. size. So the degree to which different species are social and show complex social behaviors is directly related to brain size and hence tool use. And we're going to see that on the final slide, on the next slide, that association. So I don't think this graph that's on the left-hand side of your slide here is in the current edition, the third edition of our evolution book, but I've retained it and included it here because we can see that based on the mean group size for different species of animals, that is directly related to the neocortex ratio. And that part of the brain, the neocortex, which is absolutely humongous in humans. But we can see there's a direct relationship. So we've got monkeys, we've got apes on this graph and other species. And the overall point is just simply that mean group size with increased sociality is directly related to the size of the neocortex in the brain. Now, of course, larger brains may be able to carry out more computations, more complex problem solving, simply because larger brains have more neurons, more brain cells, and more synapses, more connections between those cells. But there's a definite trade-off with having a big brain. Large brains demand more energy. So there's got to be a big selective benefit to having that big brain because it requires more food resources, it requires more energy. Gram for gram, brain tissue demands far more energy, far more food resources than other tissues in our body. Our brains consume an enormous amount of energy per day. There's two alternative hypotheses that explain bigger brains and higher intelligence. And one of them is called the ecological intelligence hypothesis, and the alternative is called the social intelligence hypothesis. Each of these is explaining how bigger brains are associated with, higher intelligence. So the ecological intelligence hypothesis is saying that finding and processing food is the most important aspect. And some foods require a bigger cognitive challenge than other foods. Hence, species that have that bigger cognitive challenge of finding food will evolve bigger brains for solving that problem. So, animals that live in a rainforest and feed off of leaves, plants, well, those are everywhere. And it wouldn't be as so demanding to find that food resource as, say, an animal that feeds on fruit. And by the way, primates are big fruit eaters. We have color vision that helps us to find fruit. Fruits ripen at different times in different seasons, and we need to be able to spot them and find them and process that information. So that's what the ecological intelligence hypothesis is saying, is that the more challenging it is to find food and process that food, then that puts a demand on and a selective pressure on a bigger brain. But the social intelligence hypothesis that says that maintaining long-term social bonds, forming alliances, and even deceiving and tricking your rivals, all three of those things are cognitively very demanding. So having a big brain will help you to do those things. So if there is a pressure, a benefit to having long-term social bonds and or forming alliances, etc., then selection is going to favor bigger brains. And indeed, we fall into that category as humans because we have long-term social bonds, form alliances, deceive our rivals. So these are not mutually exclusive because indeed, getting a bigger brain to find food and process that information also might help us to have more complex social structures. So we shouldn't view these two hypotheses as being either or. the reality is that the answer could be a mixture of these two explanations. Is a reason for big brains in different species or particular species. So this rounds out our chapter, a fun chapter on behavior and the evolution of behavior, and tracking down and explaining the evolution of different behaviors and complex behaviors in brains in different groups.